This episode is brought to you by MeUndies. While MeUndies can't totally help your love life this Valentine's Day, they can offer you insanely comfy undies and loungewear to buy or gift. MeUndies has so many awesome Valentine's Day prints and styles. Plus, you can match with your partner, friends, or even your pets. This Valentine's Day, give the gift that'll keep them thinking of you and score huge site-wide savings at MeUndies.com/Spotify. That's MeUndies.com/Spotify. MeUndies. Comfort from the outside in.
This episode is brought to you by LifeLock. The new year brings new health goals and wealth goals. Protecting your identity is an important step. LifeLock monitors millions of data points per second. If your identity is stolen, LifeLock's restoration specialist will fix it, guaranteed or your money back. Resolve to make identity health and wealth part of your New Year's goals with LifeLock. Save up to 40% your first year. Visit LifeLock.com/podcast. Terms apply.
Hey everyone, how goes it? Another cold open. You're listening to the China History Podcast, and I'm your host, Laszlo Montgomery. And this recording is being made in the final weeks of the Year of the Dragon. I have another good one for you. I'm happy to have with me Mr. Andrew Shaw. Andrew was formerly a BBC journalist, but chucked it all in to pursue his dream to learn to carve jade. He spent 2 years studying with respected Suzhou masters. Aside from being an author, Andrew's the only foreigner to be accepted as a master jade carver in China. And after perfecting his craft, Andrew Shaw opened his own workshop and gallery, and over the years he has established his name in the world of jade artistry. He has 2 books out concerning jade, Jade Life from 2019, and out now, A Jade Treasury, Ancient Legends, Modern Myths, Fascinating Stories, and Strange Facts Surrounding the Stone of Heaven. As we record this, I'm in Los Angeles, and Andrew is in the historic city of Wuhan in Hubei province. And I was able to cut a special deal with Andrew's publicist to invite him back on the CHP to discuss the history of jade in China. But for this episodio especial, we're going to be discussing his book that came out last year, and it's called Spoil. Andrew Shaw, welcome to the CHP.
Hi, Laszlo. Glad to be here. Thank you for having me.
The pleasure's all mine. Glad you could make it. Well, I came straight out and didn't bury the lead. I already let everyone know that you'll be back again to talk about the history and lore behind jade. And I hope a little bit about your life and how you hitched your spirit to this mineral. But this time we're going to be discussing the emotive subject of looted treasures and artifacts plundered from China's imperial palaces, private estates, museums, and right out of the ancient tombs that would be accidentally discovered. And you do a really nice deep dive on this subject in your monograph, Spoil. So in this time we have together, let's pull no punches and lay that smelly corpse from the colonial era back onto the autopsy table and pick through it one more time to look at the history behind these plundered treasures and cultural artifacts. So what better lead-in is there than the Camellia sinensis leaf, a botanical substance that ignited the Opium Wars and a concatenation of events that led to the Treaty Port era and frequent instances of looting of China's national treasures, and some may argue tea even led to the fall of the Qing dynasty. So can you give me a nice condensed but flavorful rundown on the rogues gallery of the worst looters in China between the Opium Wars and the Boxer Rebellion, and the role tea played in all this?
Well, I suppose to start with, the role tea played in all this was that Britain had a dreadful balance of payments because they imported so much tea, millions of tons per year. And as the silver flowed out towards China and the tea flowed in towards Britain, Britain started to go broke. So they needed to find something or find some way of redressing this balance. What they found was opium. So while tea was being poured in British cups, opium started to be smoked in Chinese pipes. And this, of course, led to the First Opium War, which involved Britain and no other foreign nation. So I suppose the real rogues gallery started with the British, who invaded China in 1839 or 1840, and brought the Qing dynasty to its knees, forced them to accept more and more opium, and began the looting. So that's the role I think that tea has played in the rogues gallery or the looting of China. The first people to go into China and to start looting it were the British, mainly because they were drinking too much tea and it was costing the country a fortune.
So we're always informed about looted treasures stolen from Chinese owners and transported back to Europe or America. What was actually stolen? What were the preferred artifacts?
Well, it started off when in 1840, when the British went in, they didn't really have that much information about true Chinese treasures like the porcelains and the jades and the ceramics, etc. They were just after something they could melt down for profit. So in the first instance in the 1840s, the British really took as much gold and silver as they could. A few of the officers who were a bit more educated perhaps, started to take some of the jades and some of the ceramics. But it wasn't until later when they sacked the Summer Palace in 1860 and they began to see the beauty of the treasures in China that they really started to loot in earnest. And looting, of course, fell into two categories. There was the stuff that was going into museums and collections, like the beautiful jades, the ceramics, the scrolls, the paintings, etc., etc. But basically, even at this time, what they were doing was they were in it for profit. They were stealing things because they wanted to make money. So a lot of very beautiful objects that were made of gold and silver and precious gems were either broken up or melted down. A great example was an Australian officer attached to the British Army in 1860 who earned the nickname China Jim because he found a solid gold pagoda in the Summer Palace in one of the temples and sold it for what was the equivalent of £1 million today. There were just so many instances of the British, the French and many other people between 1840 and the Boxer Rebellion in 1900 who just stole things mainly for profit. You've probably heard, of course, about the dog. They even stole the dogs, of course. It's like from the Summer Palace, one British officer took a dog back to England, and every Pekingese in England is a descendant of that dog and a couple of others that were looted. They even called the dog Looty, so proud were they of looting at the time.
The British and the French, they usually get top billing as far as the most egregious plunderers of Chinese cultural treasures. But what about the Russians and the Japanese? Why do they seem to get off so lightly?
It's not just the Russians and the Japanese. I think a lot of people know about the role played by the British and the French in the Opium Wars, which led to the looting of the Summer Palace and the sacking and the burning down of the Summer Palace. But it wasn't just the Japanese and the Russians. It was virtually every European country and the United States of America and Australia who were involved in the looting. By the time of the Boxer Rebellion, there were 8 countries who'd sent armies into Beijing, occupied it, and then spent 4 or 5 months just systematically looting it. The Russians and the French, probably at that time, 1900, were the worst offenders. Some of the missionaries at the time were appalled at the things they were doing, and I hesitate to mention on a podcast which might be listened to by people of a sensitive nature or even children who are studying Chinese, the sort of things they got up to. But it beggars belief what the Russians and the French did. They were so brutal. The Japanese, of course, were there at the same time, and they were equally brutal, but respected for their bravery. The French, of course, on the other hand, were known for being the last to battle and the first to loot. Some of the things that happened that were done, especially by the French, Russians and Japanese, included they would surround a village, kill all the men, burn down the buildings, kill the children, rape the women and then kill them, then walk off with all the plunder. So there isn't anybody who comes out of it with a really good reputation. When we're talking about the 8 armies that went in there, we're talking Russia, Italian, French, German. The Germans were systematic plunderers. They were very efficient, as Germans always are. They were told by their Kaiser to loot and take everything they could in the way that Attila the Hun ravaged Europe in the ancient past. So we're talking about not just the 8 armies that went in, including the US Army, but we're talking about, at the time, there were people from every single European nation living in Beijing, and they all left with loot. If they didn't loot it themselves, they bought it from looters. And you get things like the British Indian Regiment setting themselves up in the Temple of Heaven, looting as much as they could, then sitting down, opening a market and selling it. The British, of course, were even a little bit more organised. As they did in 1860 in the Summer Palace, they had auctions held every Sunday in 1900 where everybody would turn up and they would come and bid for things. And there were just people from every walk of life, from every country, the Scandinavian countries, Norway, Sweden, Finland, every country you can think of that was a European power at the time had people in Beijing. And apart from the armies and the soldiers who looted, the ordinary citizens did as well. And I could get on to the diplomats as well. How can I put this? It's like in 1900, after the Boxer Rebellion, when Beijing was occupied by the 8 European and American powers, etc., the British ambassador to China was one of the main looters. His wife was just as bad. Lady MacDonald, I think her name was, is quoted as saying she'd packed 89 suitcases and she'd hardly begun to pack, and they were all packed with looted treasure, with jades, with ceramics, with scrolls, with manuscripts, everything like that. So it wasn't just the soldiers who were doing this, it was diplomats and the missionaries as well. People might be surprised to learn that some of the most enthusiastic looters were the people from the church who'd come across and lived there for so many years.
Gee, nobody looks good. Where are the most controversial of Chinese treasures? Which countries are holding, let's say, the most sensitive of ancient and imperial relics?
Well, I think the most blatant example is the Chinese Museum at Fontainebleau. In 1860, after the French had taken part in the sacking and looting of the Summer Palace, the officers returned to France and gave to the emperor's wife 300 or 400 artefacts they'd looted from the Summer Palace, including jade, gold, precious gems, all sorts of things, loads of porcelain, food dogs, many things. And the Empress decided to build a museum, which still exists. It's called the Chinese Museum, and it's at Fontainebleau in France. And there is no doubt that every one of those items, and there's more than 300, are loot from China. They were stolen, they were pillaged, they were looted. Nobody denies this. The French don't deny it. They've become quite quiet about it recently, but I'd say that's the most blatant example. But you can think of examples all over Europe. The National Museum of Scotland has a solid gold jug that was used by the emperor at the time to wash his hands before meals, and that's on display. And we have no doubt at all that it was looted from the Summer Palace, because one of the generals was given this as a gift by his officers during the looting, in thanks for the way he'd commanded the forces and invaded the Summer Palace. That's still there. And we'll find things every single place you can think of, even countries that didn't invade, even countries where perhaps there was no one there. An example is the Chester Beatty Library in Ireland, which was quite a backwater at the time, has got 10 jade books, some of which were definitely looted during the Boxer Rebellion and in 1860 during the Second Opium War. They've actually checked where they came from, and one of these books, of course, was looted by the ambassador Claude MacDonald, Sir Claude MacDonald, the British ambassador to China in 1900. There's examples in the Swedish National Museum, in the Norway's National Museum, the French National Museum, and who knows how many pieces are in St. Petersburg. One of the senior officers of the Russian army in 1900 during the Boxer Rebellion left with a suitcase and presented it to the Tsar. Perhaps some of those pieces are in the St. Petersburg Museum. What we've got at the moment is pieces from all over the world pieces from China which are in museums and private collections all over the world. And very few people are checking up on where these are now. There's a very famous American scholar and another person in England who are investigating this. But it's a tortuous journey. An example I can give is they're now checking auction records from the 1860s and 70s, which is a very good way of finding out how many pieces have been stolen. And in the 1860s in England and France, there are auction records which talk about this piece was looted, that piece was looted. It says who sold them and who bought them. But trying to trace them now is a nightmare. 150 years later, they may be in different people's hands. And of course, those people who do have looted treasures, which do have provenance, are very reluctant to come forward and tell people they've got them. So, for example, if a piece does come up for auction or come up for sale in the West, there's an outcry in China and it's quickly withdrawn from sale. As China has become more powerful and bigger and an economic superpower, people are starting to take notice and showing more attention and more care in what they sell. These treasures were things that are very precious to China, and they're very, very sensitive now about them being put up for auction.
We hear about the Elgin marbles and the Rosetta Stone and the matter of restitution of looted treasures. So what's the holdup in returning some of these more famous treasures? Is it a matter of money, national dignity? Why does this drag out so slow?
There is no international law which says these treasures should be returned. There are agreements and treaties between various countries, etc., and more of these things are voluntarily being given back. But there is no law that says they should be given back. And without a law, museums are reluctant to send them back to China. And in the case of British museums and French museums, it's enshrined in law that any national museum is not allowed to sell or give things back to wherever they came from. So that makes it extremely difficult. You mentioned the Elgin marbles, of course, and it was the 7th Lord Elgin who stole those or bought them for peanuts from Greece at the turn of the 18th century. And, of course, it was his son, the 8th Earl, who sacked and burnt down the Summer Palace. He said at the time that he wasn't a thief and he wasn't going to take anything from the palace. But strangely enough, when he died and his estate was put up for sale, 80 very valuable items from the Summer Palace happened to be in his collection. One wonders where he got those from. One thing I can say is that there's been rumblings for some time now that the Elgin marbles will soon be returned. And one of the reasons that the British Museum has been reluctant to send them back is because if they are given back, it opens the floodgates for every other country in the Third World or the developing world that has been looted and sacked by imperial forces from Europe and North America is going to start screaming and asking for their artifacts back as well. There's already been some success in asking for things back, but there's just so much that was looted, and in so many museums and private collections, it's going to take an awful long time, if it ever happens, if an international law is passed or agreement is reached before any of these things return. I'd like to also mention, because you're from the United States, about how I think the United States comes out of this better than any of the European countries that made war on China. The American army comes out of it, in my opinion, better than any of the other military forces that occupied or invaded China. For example, during the Boxer Rebellion, or after the Boxer Rebellion, when Beijing was carved up between the 8 powers and each had its own zone of influence, the Americans were the only one who seemed to uphold the law. So much so that Chinese people from all the other controlled sectors or sectors controlled by the other imperial powers flooded into the American sector for safety to such an extent that there became a housing problem. And when a couple of years later the Americans were preparing to leave, they actually signed a petition with hundreds, if not thousands of signatures asking them to stay and protect them. There's one very funny story, or one very interesting story that sort of sums up what the American soldiers were like at the time. And they did loot, but they were perhaps a little more circumspect than the people from their brother imperial powers or brother countries at the time. Two American soldiers on patrol in their sector came across two Sikhs from an Indian regiment looting in their sector. They tried to arrest them. The Sikhs fled. When they got back to the British sector, they started firing at the American soldiers. The Americans seemed to have been better shots. They fired back and killed them both. Now, the British, of course, with their stiff upper lip, were outraged at this and demanded a court-martial. General Adna Chaffee, who was in charge of the Americans, agreed to this. He held an inquiry, found his two soldiers not guilty, and gave them commendations for marksmanship. It seems that the Americans at this time, unlike the British and the other imperial powers that came from Europe, seemed to have a bit more of a sense of humour than those from the old country.
This episode is brought to you by Shopify. Upgrade your business with Shopify, home of the #1 checkout on the planet. Shop Pay boosts conversions up to 50%, meaning fewer carts going abandoned and more sales going cha-ching. So if you're into growing your business, get a commerce platform that's ready to sell wherever your customers are. Visit shopify.com to upgrade your selling today.
This episode is brought to you by Amazon. Sometimes the most painful part of getting sick is the getting better part. Waiting on hold for an appointment, sitting in crowded waiting rooms, standing in line at the pharmacy, that's painful. Amazon One Medical and Amazon Pharmacy remove those painful parts of getting better with things like 24/7 virtual visits and prescriptions delivered to your door. Thanks to Amazon Pharmacy and Amazon One Medical, healthcare just got less painful.
So let me ask you, what's your rebuttal to those who claim these looted treasures were spared from destruction during the Cultural Revolution and other domestic upheavals in the PRC since 1949?
I have no rebuttal to that. My book is about what the West and Japan did to China for profit. I'm not talking about politics or internal politics here. What I'm talking about is how the West invaded purely for profit, looted and sacked for profit, and took away stuff just because they wanted to make money. I have included a chapter in the book about Chinese people who looted for profit as well, but I'm not really involved in the politics of it at all. What I've tried to do is use the memoirs of over 60 people who were involved in the wars against China and use that as a sort of confession about what they did, and backed it up by the latest research, which I think of as the forensic evidence which backs up those confessions. I haven't really mentioned much about the Japanese, but I think in the 19th century it was Europe that was mainly to blame, but in the 20th century it was the Japanese who took over. They were as savage, if not more savage, than the European powers that came before them. There are those who think perhaps that they learned their savagery from the British and were respected for the way they could kill, maim and loot rather than for their civilization. They seem to have copied the British habit. For example, during the First Opium War, the British couldn't take prisoners, so either let them go or shot them. And the Japanese in 1900 were exactly the same. They didn't take many prisoners. They just shot people because it was too much trouble to look after them.
So as guilty as these foreign nations were in the looting that went on during the period of the 100 years of humiliation, what about the local Chinese people? Surely they were also participators in this cultural, crime, I guess we could call it. Weren't the warlords and other leaders like Chiang Kai-shek also tainted with looting public treasures and, privatizing them?
Indeed. I have included a chapter in my book about how Chinese people looted purely for financial profit. It started as early as the First Opium War. The camp followers who followed the British Army from city to city were equally savage in killing and looting as the British were. And this happened again in 1860 during the Second Opium War. There were 3,000 camp followers that followed the British and French armies to the Summer Palace, and they swarmed over the walls even before the British got there, looting and taking what they could. So yes, indeed, the Chinese local people at that time were just as bad as their Western counterparts. And of course it got worse after the Europeans had left. In 1928, for example, the imperial Qing tombs were looted. The tombs of Qianlong and Cixi were smashed open and blown open with gunpowder and everything stolen from them. And there is significant evidence to believe that it was Chiang Kai-shek who was behind this. He didn't do it himself. It was another warlord who did it. But within a few weeks of the tombs being looted, his new bride was seen wearing some of Cixi's jewellery. There is some evidence as well that Chiang Kai-shek continued to sell off most of the imperial treasury when he took power in the late 1920s. His brother-in-law and his family are reported in some quarters, and there's some research to support this, to say that many of the thousands of crates of imperial treasures that used to be in the Palace Museum in Beijing never made it to Taiwan when he fled there after being defeated by the communists, but were sold off and are in museums and private collections around the world.
So you said the American army, they weren't as bad as the rest, but what's America's dark, dirty secret, as far as the U.S. Army's participation in the Eight-Nation Alliance during the Boxer Rebellion? Weren't there treasures plundered by American troops and diplomats?
Yes, the American troops are quite open about the fact that they plundered and looted, but the people who from the United States of America who were perhaps far more guilty were the diplomats and the missionaries. The American secretary to China was a guy called Herbert Squires, and he stole and looted so much stuff. Some of it he looted himself, a lot of it he bought, that when he left China, he left with 3 railroad cars full of looted treasure. He got back to New York, he went to New York, and he donated one of these railroad cars full of treasure to the Metropolitan Museum in New York. And the papers got hold of this, and someone from the New York Post at the time asked the Met, says, look, are you sure you should be accepting looted treasures? And the director of the Met at the time, the curator, stood up tall, stuck out his chin and said, I'm sure that Herbert Squires is a gentleman and has never stolen anything. And that treasure, I believe, is still in the Met. I've asked them 3 or 4 times and sent inquiries without reply. But there seems to be, there's an awful lot of treasure that Herbert Squires donated to the Met, which is still there. What he did with the rest, he sold most of it, and he bought himself the equivalent of what we would call today a super yacht, which he moored at Cowes on the British Isles. And that's the diplomats. But don't get me started on the missionaries. One missionary, Gilbert Reed, who'd been in China for some time, is quoted as saying, I wish I'd looted more. The missionaries were as bad as anybody else. They thought of it as a bit of a lark. Not only that, but they would actually, because they'd been in China for longer than anybody else, and many of them could speak Chinese, they knew where the treasures were. So that if they didn't loot them themselves, they would actually direct their army friends to where these treasures might be found, and they'd take a cut of the proceedings. In their defence, it can be said that some of the money that they acquired from selling looted artefacts, they used for their Rice Bowl Christian flocks, their flocks who'd lost everything in the Boxer Rebellion and were probably homeless as well. But I have to say that the soldiers seem to come out of it better than the diplomats and the missionaries, not just from America, but from Britain and other countries as well. I already mentioned Claude MacDonald and what he and his wife took, and Herbert Squires was no better.
So what's to be done? I mean, we live in a different world than our great-grandparents, and of course everyone who came before them. How can this matter be reconciled by the interested parties, to both sides' equal satisfaction?
It is slowly happening. More and more treasures are being returned to China. This is mainly because of China's position in the world as an economic superpower and people wanting to, cozy up to it for financial gain. Again, financial gain is the driving factor in this. The best example I can give of this is one of the major luxury brands, Kering, which covers things like Louis Vuitton, etc., gave back some very, very important treasures to China. And the only reason they've done this is so they can have access to the Chinese market. This is easily shown because Kering, which has Louis Vuitton, Balenciaga, etc., and others under its umbrella, also owns Christie's, one of the biggest auction houses in the world. About 3 months after they'd given back some significant treasures to China in a ceremony in Beijing, suddenly Christie's became the only Western auction house allowed to operate within China. So again, as everything was looted for financial gain, it seems that things are being given back by people for financial reasons as well. Of course, China's a huge market and there are a lot of people who want to get in there. So more and more pieces are being given back. But of course, as I've mentioned already, it's difficult to separate those things that were looted from those things that were actually bought later legitimately.
So, you know what, I just can't understand. What's your take on the relative ease with which a few thousand foreign troops could invade a place like China 3 times in the 19th century and essentially get away with murder?
I think that technology was extremely important when it came to the European powers being so superior to the Chinese in battle and in war. The best example I can give of this is the first iron steamship, the first iron battleship in the world in 1840. The Nemesis was sent from Britain to China. It had tremendous firepower. Its guns were accurate and could cut a man in half from 2 miles away. The Chinese cannonballs just bounced off its steel sides. It didn't rely on wind. It could go wherever it wanted. Not only that, the men of war that the British brought with them could be towed upstream by the Nemesis whenever there was no wind to drive them where they wanted to go. By 1860, they had guns called Armstrong guns, which were accurate up to 5 miles. And it's not just the technology and the superior weaponry. It's the fact that the Chinese weaponry, most of them still had pikes, ancient muskets, bows and arrows, etc. And some of them even fought from horseback. A great example of how ancient the musketry was of the Chinese soldiery was that there's one recorded incident of a man having a musket which was 179 years old, and many of the cannon that were in the forts that the Chinese had rusted and were completely useless. So it's no surprise, perhaps, that such a small force, which is very, very mobile, could go where it wanted and do what it wanted and destroy such superior forces.
So I think we've taken this subject far enough today. Might I suggest to all CHP listeners to go check out this book, Spoil. The author is Andrew Shaw, who was kind enough to come on the CHP and discuss this sensitive subject with me. I'll have a link to the book at the show notes. Thank you so much, Andrew, for your insight into this history and sharing it with the CHP audience. I look forward to our next discussion about the history of jade and your other book, A Jade Treasury. I appreciate you coming on the CHP.
It's been my pleasure, Laszlo. Great pleasure talking to you. I've always enjoyed your website and your podcast. They're a great resource for anybody who's interested in Chinese history, Chinese idiom, and China today.
Thanks so much. Well, this is Laszlo Montgomery signing off from a blustery and intensely windy day here in LA, California. We're international news. Fires are burning in a whole bunch of places, but nothing too close to your humble narrator's neighborhood. I have all my backyard cats hunkered down in the indoor cat bunker reserved for just these kinds of weather conditions. Thanks to all of you who checked in with me to see if I was okay. Okay, enough of me. I thank you all for listening, and I do hope you'll come back again next time for more Andrew Shaw in another exciting episode of the China History Podcast.